Hajar, what was your boldest career move so far? Was it the moment you said yes or the moment you walked away?
I wouldn't claim that I did very risky career moves, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
Maybe moving to a new country for a new job.
Yeah, I think that counts. When a young professional takes a risky career decision, is it courage or defiance?
I would say it can be both.
Well, I know a man who left success, chose uncertainty, and still reached the very top.
As they say in finance lingo, no risk, no reward.
Well, finance it is.
Welcome to Threads of Africa, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar.
And I'm Ramdan.
And together we're weaving a rich understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
Today's book is a memoir. It's actually the second memoir that we are discussing on this podcast. The first one was the one by Fatima Mernissi, the late Moroccan writer. And this one is written by one of the most brilliant contemporary African financier. His name is Tidjane Thiam. And the book is titled Without Prejudice. It was published in September 2025, I think a few weeks before the presidential elections in Cote d'Ivoire. You will understand the context soon. And yeah, I pre-ordered it and read it, I think, around October 2025.
Yeah, and I should add here that the book's title, Without Prejudice, is a bit of a play on the words, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so beyond the trivial meaning of the expression, without prejudice, it's also used in the business/legal context. A without prejudice letter is usually a communication used in dispute resolution context to encourage open settlement discussions without fear that what is said will later be used against the sender in court. Basically, in plain English, the sender is saying, or the sender of a without prejudice letter is saying, I'm willing to negotiate or settle this dispute, but nothing in this letter can be used as evidence against me if negotiations fail.
Yeah, I have heard Tidjane Thiam explain what you just said in one of the interviews he had before the book came out, and he said precisely what he just said.
So it was a very conscious use of the title.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
So much like the book we discussed in the previous episodes, the one written by Ousmane Ndiaye, the Senegalese journalist. The title was Africa Against Democracy, Myth, Denial, and Peril, which, if you haven't listened to the episodes, I invite you to check it out. So, much like that book, I did not initially read this memoir with the intention of turning it into a podcast episode. But just recently, perhaps 1 month after finishing the book, I found myself thinking that Thiam is such a compelling and complex figure that it might be genuinely insightful for our audience to explore his life, his trajectory, and the themes he reflects on in this book.
Yeah. And maybe to add some context to our listeners, and obviously we'll talk more about Thiam's story as we discuss his book. The current relevance stems from the fact that he recently intended to present his candidacy to the presidential election in Ivory Coast.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah, Cote d'Ivoire.
Do you know why?
You mean why should I say Cote d'Ivoire, not Ivory Coast?
Yeah.
No, you tell me.
Well, the current president of Cote d'Ivoire, I think there was an anecdote around the name, and he said that it's sometimes when it's translated to other languages, they the officials of the country do not even are not even aware when the country is mentioned. For instance, if you translate Côte d'Ivoire, which means Ivory Coast in English, to German, it will sound something totally different. And if you don't understand German and you are perhaps in an international forum where, as an official of the country, someone says Elfenbeinkünste or what?
Yeah, in German that would be Elfenbeinküste.
So you wouldn't know that's your country that they are referring to. So that's why he decided that everyone should say Côte d'Ivoire.
Fair enough. I mean, still, like, some countries still get translated. South Africa, for example. But yeah.
And Germany as well. Allemagne in French.
True.
It's totally different from Germany.
Yeah. Côte d'Ivoire it is. I mean, if that's what the president wishes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you talked about the date of the election. And obviously, as you said, Thiam did present his candidacy to the election and got unexpectedly rejected due to reasons related to his nationality, which we'll come back to later. And that led him to exile into France. So currently he's based in France. The presidential election in Côte d'Ivoire was held, as you said, on the 25th of October 2025, and in which the incumbent president Alassane Ouattara was elected or re-elected for a fourth term.
Oh, a fourth term, yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And obviously, fourth term sounds like a lot. So you might also guess that.
Well, by some standards.
True. Yeah, depends. Yeah, you also might guess that the election was kind of contested, and also that indicates that the political environment in the country right now is quite volatile.
Yeah, thank you for this. You got it ahead of me, but thanks. I was planning on bringing it up toward the end of the episodes.
Okay, so I spoiled your ending.
No. So another interesting parallel with our previous episode is that this memoir is also the very first book written by Tidjane Thiam.
Yep.
The book is structured around 7 chapters. But for the purpose of this episode, I chose to reorganize it in around 3 main themes. So the first part covers Tidjane Thiam's early childhood up until university, and I will call this section the rare African golden childhood. I call this the rare African golden childhood deliberately in contrast with the title he himself gives to his first chapter, which was Early Challenges. You will understand soon why. But to be clear, there were undeniably profound emotional challenges in his early life, but they are not the kind of hardships one usually has in mind when speaking of an African childhood, at least not in the collective imagination.
So it's not a typical from rags to riches story?
No.
Yeah.
It's not. And that distinction that I'm making here matters. It's very much my own reading of the text, but you'll see why I decided to choose this title for the first part of the book. Now, the second section focuses on his professional trajectory from his early years at the World Bank to McKinsey, a brief return to serve his country, and then back to Europe, where he would eventually reach the very top C-suite positions in global finance. I would title this part A Brilliant Career. And finally, my third section brings us to the concluding reflections of the book, where Tidjane Thiam steps back from his personal story to share his thoughts on Africa, its place in the world, its challenges, and more importantly, its future. But I would call this section his rocky start in politics. And I think you kind of already referred to the reason why choosing this title for the last section of the book. So the book is written in English, which some might find unexpected for someone who comes from a francophone country and was educated in France. But I recall that Tidjane Thiam explained in an interview that that the choice was actually simple. It was easier for him to write in English. I remember him saying that he started in French, but then had to switch to English because there are certain technical terms from the finance jargon
Yeah.
and the corporate world that he couldn't easily find in French, and because all of his corporate or majority of his professional life happened in English, it was easier for him to write the book in English.
Yeah, makes sense. And it also means that the title that we explained earlier, Without Prejudice, is also the original title of the book.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, in this episode, we are trying something a little new. I reached out to a good friend of mine, someone I knew was reading this book as well. I found out by checking his WhatsApp story
Yeah.
and asked if he would be willing to share his thoughts. He was kind enough to send a recording, and we will be weaving his reflections into this episode as we go. So my friend's name is Milen Nsaikila. He's a trained economist and data scientist and an avid reader, particularly of essays. So thank you, Milen, for trusting us with your voice. And if you're listening, you, our audience, and this is something you would like to take part in by sharing your reflections on the books we read, feel free to reach out to us on social media, and we would love to explore more conversations like this with you, our listeners.
Exactly. And also, if you want to suggest a book that you want us to review or you want to review with us, please do reach out to us.
Now, this is normally where I briefly introduce the author. And I wasn't sure whether it was necessary to include this section for this episode, given that we are discussing a memoir. But for those of you who may not be familiar with Tidjane Thiam, he was born and raised in Côte d'Ivoire, in West Africa, partly there and partly in Morocco, which I will come back to shortly. He is arguably one of the most brilliant African leaders in finance of his generation, having served as CEO of at least two major companies in the sector, in the UK and in Switzerland. He was the grandson of Felix Mfweboing. More precisely, Mfweboing was the uncle of his mother, and you will soon understand why I chose to title the first section The Rare African Golden Childhood.
And I guess we will talk more about which are these major European banks and, most importantly, who is the famous grandfather of Tidjane Thiam as we progress more into the story, right?
Yes, I will. So without further ado, let's dive straight into the first theme. The first theme, the rare African golden childhood. I think the reason Tidjane Thiam titles his first chapter Early Challenges has largely to do with his relationship, or rather, the absence of one relationship with his father during his early childhood. He grew up without his father physically present, at least for a certain period during his childhood, and he knew that he existed. He had seen photographs, heard stories through his mother, but he never actually met his dad. And the reason, well, he never met his dad during his early childhood, okay? The reason is that his father was falsely imprisoned for conspiracy against President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, to whom he had been close.
Okay, so hold on there. We said that Tidjane Thiam is a grandson of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who is actually, as you explained, the president of Côte d'Ivoire back then.
Yeah.
And also to add to that, he was the first president and the founding father of the country and one of the architects of the independence of Côte d'Ivoire.
Exactly.
So he is his grandson.
Yeah.
Houphouët-Boigny is also the one who imprisoned his father, right?
Correct.
So basically, he imprisoned his son-in-law.
That's correct.
Okay, that sounds like a very complicated family.
Yes. So Thiam explains why this was deeply difficult for the family. And there is no denying that growing up without a father is a real hardship, even if it was for a relatively short period. But I also somehow get the sense that at that age, he himself was perhaps too young to fully grasp the emotional weight of what was happening around him. I'm not sure, because maybe he's, because he's a smart guy.
Smart kid.
Maybe he was some sort of genius. But anyway, for context, and I don't think that I'm spoiling anything by saying this, his father held French citizenship. And this detail will later have consequences for Tidjane Thiam's own political trajectory, which I think you already kind of referred to earlier. Now, before the imprisonment of his father, he was the French head of Radio Côte d'Ivoire, so he was a journalist basically, which already tells you something important about how deeply intertwined power structures were with the former colonial authority at the time. That being a French citizenship, being also the director of Radio Côte d'Ivoire.
Yep, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that the fact that he's French gave him access to such an important and, let's say, position close to power.
Potentially, but remember who he's also married to.
True, correct, yeah.
So yes, one challenge was emotional, growing up without a father for some period of time, and another was, shall I say, material. His father was the main breadwinner of the family, and his imprisonment did bring financial strain on the family. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of bizarre for the family of the president, plus for someone who's with such affluence.
True, right?
But yeah, I mean, facts are facts.
Yeah. And here's where my own rating comes in. I personally know far harsher childhood stories from across Africa. And despite everything, the family continued living in a grace and favor house provided by France. And his mother was still the favorite niece of President Houphouët-Boigny. And, despite the fact that he had jailed her husband, and Tidjane Thiam's father's cousin was a minister in the government of Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal.
I'm a bit lost here. Is his father Senegalese or Ivoirian?
So he had French.
French, okay. On paper, but
yeah. And
culturally speaking.
yeah, okay. Originally from Senegal, but
okay.
He was born in Dakar, and I think Milan will give us more details on his father's upbringing.
Okay.
But he was originally from Senegal, and Thiam is in fact a Senegalese name. However, his father migrated to Côte d'Ivoire, and because he was born in Dakar at a time when people born there were granted French citizenship, his father held French citizenship.
So was it during colonization time?
Yeah, during colonization, people born in Dakar, just Dakar, not
became automatically French citizens.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting fact. Yeah.
Yeah. And Tidjane Thiam held French citizenship. Yeah, I think Milan provided more details about his father. Let's take a listen.
Born into what can reasonably be described as an African aristocratic family, there is little doubt that although Tidjane Thiam at times downplays his privilege, his background is far from typical for most Africans. Few can claim a father who served as minister and later ambassador, or a mother who was the favored niece of the sitting and founding president of the country. By Thiam's own account, however, his father, Amadou Thiam, endured an exceptionally harsh childhood. His father, Tidjane's grandfather, was largely absent, leaving behind an illiterate wife and more than 10 children to support on meager remittances he sent from abroad before marrying in neighboring Mali. Growing up in these conditions, Amadou Thiam spent much of his early life in poverty and deprivation. Nevertheless, the decision by his parents to ensure that he was born in Dakar, the capital of Senegal, proved very consequential. This circumstance enabled him to gain admission into French school system that, in Tidjane's words, was, quote, adept at identifying promising African children who would later be trained and promoted into an indigenous elite. Amadou Thiam would later rise to become a minister under Felix Houphouët-Boigny before his subsequent arraignment and incarceration, and almost 15 years later, appointment as Ivorian ambassador to Morocco. While these stories of hardship, often recounted by his father, undoubtedly shaped Tidjane Thiam's worldview and prepared him for the professional challenges he would later face in life, it is important to draw a clear distinction between inherited narrative and lived experience. The struggles of his father were not his own and should not be conflated as such. Tidjane Thiam benefited from an elite upbringing that millions of Africans can scarcely imagine, let alone experience. His education in some of the best schools in Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, and later France represents a level of opportunity that remains inaccessible to the vast majority of Africans.
So the archetype of from rags to riches applies rather to his dad, it seems.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there were challenges, but perhaps by his standards, eventually his father was freed, and Tidjane Thiam recounts a rather humorous story about how he eventually reconnected with his father after his release from prison. I won't spoil that anecdote. And yeah, the family moved to Morocco, as Milen just told us. And then here I want to go into the details of how his father later fell back into the good graces of the very president who had imprisoned him. If you are interested in that political irony, I really encourage you to read the book. Now, what matters here is that his father was eventually appointed ambassador of Cote d'Ivoire to Morocco.
Yeah. And again, from rags to riches and a happy ending for the arc of the father, right?
Yes, yeah. Now, this marks the next phase of his childhood, a phase that unfolds in a sublime modernist palace acquired by President Houphouët-Boigny in Rabat, where his father assumed his ambassadorial role. And I guess the challenges in this phase were of a different nature, maybe. Thiam describes experiences that I would call negrophobia and perhaps not racism in the institutional sense, but everyday hostility.
So what is your definition of racism versus negrophobia, or what is the difference?
The difference that I'm making here is that in their context in Morocco, it's true that perhaps some of the incidents were related to their race, but also, because of the fact that they were a wealthy kind of black family, which I think could have also happened to, the Moroccan elite back
Mm.
then. So yeah, perhaps there is a skin color dimension to it, but if there is, it's more negrophobia rather than, a sense of black people being fundamentally or biologically different from, people with other skin colors, which is, the definition of race, or where the notion of racism stems from.
Yeah.
So,
So more kind of similar to xenophobia in a sense, the fear of the other or the fear of the different,
yeah,
basically.
yeah, some of the incidents were like people spitting on the car as they drove to school or on their way to the market. He also recounts his very first day at primary school when he was set upon by a group of boys. And while I don't want to minimize that experience, I also think it's worth noting that this kind of incidents can happen in many schools, in many countries, and it's not always reducible to race alone.
When was this again?
I think in the 60s, because he went to France in the 70s, the next section that I'm going to talk about.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is that this experience differs completely from what we recounted from Fatima's Mernisi's book, remember? We said that she explains how in her childhood, which was in the 30s, 40s, Morocco was open to people from sub-Saharan Africa and how they integrated into the society and was a seamless part of it, basically.
Yeah, you're right. And yeah, I think there is a gap between, the 30s and the 60s, but still, I think people experience things differently. Fatima Mernissi is
Exactly.
Moroccan, and Tidjane Thiam is, you know, Ivorian
Yeah.
and black, so he would have a different perspective and a different lived experience
Yeah.
of things. So I fully recognize that some of these incidents can be deeply traumatic for a teenager. And yet, I also want to say that being driven to school, going on countless shopping trips to Paris with his mother, or growing up in a palace in Rabat, or inviting his German best friend at the time, someone named Volkmar Schmidt.
Wow. Such a German name. Volker
Yeah,
Schmidt.
Volkmar Schmidt. He invited him for Christmas in Cote d'Ivoire and took him to meet his presidential grandfather. I think these are not exactly what comes to mind when people speak of childhood challenges in Africa, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and still, and as you also mentioned, to be fair, we shouldn't sound as if we are dismissing the author's feeling and how he experienced his childhood. After all, there is more to life than money and affluence, even if you go every week shopping in Paris, right?
True.
But I agree with you that several Africans would not recognize themselves, or more precisely, their childhoods in Thiam's experience.
Yes, and now I think you would understand why I call this section the rare African golden childhood. Again, that's my reading, and there are many fascinating stories, anecdotes from his Moroccan years, including vivid accounts of what they believe were two failed coup attempts against King Hassan II. And again, I don't want to spoil this for you. I encourage you to read the book.
Yeah. And here, I mean, without going into the detail, I believe his awareness about these coups show how close to key people of power in Moroccan politics he was. I mean, I
Yeah.
wonder if the average child in Morocco would remember or even recount these events.
No, not at all. Like he was, at least I think his dad actually was present when one of the coup happened.
Yeah, there you go. So,
So
he had direct access to
exactly.
this
So
kind of
yeah,
information.
he was very close to power. That's clear. Yeah, but instead of going to the details about the stories, the anecdotes, I would like to jump ahead to the final years of his high school education and his transition to France. His last year of high school actually took place in Cote d'Ivoire. And if you're curious about why that decision was made, I really encourage you to read the book. What struck me, however, in this section are the reflections he offers on the stark contrast between his private school in Rabat, which he describes as comfortable, and the public school he later attended in Abidjan. And there he recalls a lack of desk for students, the absence of teachers for certain subjects, and even serious organizational failures around the baccalaureate exam itself.
I think we should explain to our listeners what the baccalaureate exam is.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, yeah, it is mainly the exam at the end of high school in the French educational system, which allows access to university. But are you telling me he attended public school in Côte d'Ivoire instead of a private one?
Yeah, he went to a public school, and he provided the reason for that I will not spoil here. So if you want to know why, yeah, you should read the book for yourself. But what makes this particularly striking is the candor of his analysis, especially given that his grandfather was president of the country at the time. And there is no attempt to soften the diagnosis or to look away. And I would like to leave you with a sentence he writes in this section, one that stayed with me. Quote unquote, the most significant and unfair inequalities are the ones we allow to accumulate between children.
Yeah, that's deep. And it also reflects how he's conscious about the social aspects around him as a child.
I also found the line deeply thoughtful, and to me it reads almost as a moment of self-reflection and acknowledgement of how the privileges he experienced as a child may well have translated into profound inequalities later on between himself and peers who did not have access to the same protection, stability, or opportunity. And in fact, the quotes began with lives and destinies are forged in such moments. I don't know if you are following, but I personally think that this sentence should have come after the first sentence that I quoted to make it more beautiful.
Can you read it again?
Yeah.
With the
So
other sentence?
If I was writing this, it would have been the most significant and unfair inequalities are the ones we allow to accumulate between children. Lives and destinies are forged in such moments.
Yeah.
And from there, his school years in France begin. After passing the baccalaureate in Côte d'Ivoire as the top students in the country, and he was sent to France for prépa. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, prépa refers to 2 years of extremely intense specialized training, often in math and physics, but there are many other specializations, I think literature, economics, and things. It's undertaken right after high school to prepare students for entry into elite engineering schools in France.
Yeah. And this again is also very specific to French education system.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And there are many beautiful stories, anecdotes from his time in prepa that he recounts in the book, stories that you really need to read for yourself. So rather than spoiling them here, I would like to focus on something else. The way his political and ideological conscience begins to take shape after Prépa, and especially during his time at École Polytechnique. And yes, if you're wondering, he also went to Polytechnique, one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious, engineering schools in France.
Yeah. And again, this is something very specific and typical of French education system. So the people who know it will know Polytechnique and how prestigious it is. And also, you said engineering school, right?
Yeah.
Which is specific to the French education system in the sense that it's the equivalent to engineering university. In Germany, for example, they call it technical university. But it's an university which teaches engineering and sometimes finance as well, but mainly engineering in most of the cases.
Yeah, it is. Now, back to his socio-political ideology forming at Prépa. I think he's pro-market, but contrasts his economic views with the reality that in many Western contexts, parties that champion free markets and economic liberalism are also often hostile to pluralism, diversity, and minority rights. And as a black man in France in the 1970s, facing blatant racism, he explains why he could never fully identify with right leaning political movements.
And with right leaning, he means both economic and social right leaning. Because again, I mean, are we talking like far right or are we talking like economic right in the sense that?
No, he's very nuanced in his approach. That's I think the specificity of his analytical approach and writing style. There are recounts of policies by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan
so
back
kind
then,
of,
and he positioned himself.
So the conservatives, basically, from the economic perspective.
But not black and white kind of. He would say what he likes in their policies and what he doesn't like, and also he gave the example of François Mitterrand, I think, and also positioned himself. But yeah, let me not spoil all of these stories and allow you to discover them by reading the book. So I found this part of the book particularly balanced and nuanced, as I was saying, especially when contrasted with the much more rigid positions we discussed in our previous episode on democracy. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, I encourage you to check it out. Tidjane Thiam also recounts one episode that captures this tension vividly. And at the time, he was driving a two-door BMW. And again, as I told you before, it's worth saying that this is not exactly the life trajectory of a stereotypical African student, right?
Oh, so he was driving the BMW as a student.
Did I say BMW or BMW
I think so.
or BMW?
But that's the original pronunciation. Yeah, the German one.
BMW. Yeah, so yes, he was driving a BMW and was stopped by the police for what was presented as a routine traffic control. He was driving and his passenger was a white friend and basketball teammate.
Yeah. And let me guess, it was a racial profiling situation.
Yeah, probably because he was, the driver and black. And the policeman spoke to him rudely and then proceeded to inspect the car at length, clearly searching for a reason to fine him. But the tone shifted abruptly once the officer realized that Thiam was a student at Polytechnique. So his friend, who witnessed the entire exchange, was stunned by how quickly suspicion turned into deference.
Yeah, and probably his friend has never faced such a situation before.
Probably not. He was astonished. And Thiam explains that experiences like this were not isolated incidents, He had countless encounters with the French police and of this kind in France. And yeah, I think it's through experiences like this that Thiam develops what I would call a deeply balanced relationship to political ideologies. Skeptical of state overreach, but equally wary of market friendly politics that fail to accommodate pluralism and lived racial, or if you want, societal realities.
Yeah. So market oriented but socially progressive,
Yeah,
if I
yeah.
am to summarize that.
Yes, and I will come back to some of his views when I get into the chapter on Africa's century. The one that I called his rocky starts into politics.
Yeah, I'll come back to that.
So he also recounts facing racism and discrimination when trying to secure internships during his final years of study and later when transitioning into the job market. Despite graduating at the very top of his class, he was eventually able to secure um, a position at McKinsey and was later offered a fully funded MBA at INSEAD, your school.
True.
and so yeah, he secured the position at McKinsey after what he describes as a highly competitive and transparent selection process involving around 30 interviews. Can you imagine
30
that?
interviews for McKinsey or for INSEAD?
For McKinsey. INSEAD was a scholarship provided by McKinsey while he was working there.
Ah, okay. Okay, that's crazy. 30 interviews.
That's too much. And yeah, you might have guessed it. It's now time to move on to the second theme, which I have titled "A Brilliant Career."
Yeah, I mean, a career which starts with Polytechnique, McKinsey, and INSEAD can only be brilliant.
Yeah. The second theme, a brilliant career. So for those of you who already know Tidjane Thiam, you're probably familiar with the sheer scale of his career, especially for someone who was born, raised, and initially educated in Africa, at least educated in Africa until university, right? He first joined McKinsey in France, as I said, before entering the Young Professional program at the World Bank Group. And then he left the World Bank within a year to rejoin McKinsey, this time working for McKinsey in New York. And before making what he describes as a homecoming, returning to Cote d'Ivoire to take on a role in the government. So from Cote d'Ivoire, his trajectory shifts decisively toward global finance, eventually leading him to C-suite leadership roles in top-tier financial institutions, Fortune 500, insurance, and banking groups.
Culminating to being the CEO of Credit Suisse, the Swiss bank, which was later acquired by UBS. So yeah, those of you who know
the defunct
finance would know the story. The defunct Swiss bank.
Swiss bank.
The late Swiss bank, Credit Suisse. Yeah.
That's how it was described in the Financial Times article about the book. We should link that.
Yes,
article.
We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
So I think these are all things that can easily be found on his LinkedIn profile or on his Wikipedia page, or just by listening to interviews he has given as well. So rather than simply walking you through the different steps of his career, I would prefer to reflect on how he approached it and discuss some of the key recurring themes that emerge from his accounts, and also based on my reading of this section of the memoir. And I think that way, I hope not to spoil the stories, but instead to offer a more analytical perspective. So my first reading of his career trajectory is that Tidjane Thiam is quite clearly a risk taker. at least when it comes to career decisions. And this is visible from the very beginning all the way through to today, actually. So this is someone who struggles to enter the job market, as I said, because he was black and nobody wanted to recruit him in France. I think Milan, we come back to that. And this, um, despite having outstanding academic results, having gone to the best schools, but eventually he got recruited by McKinsey, right? And while working there, as I said, he secured a scholarship from McKinsey to pursue an MBA at INSEAD. And just 3 years later, he made what I would call his first bold move by leaving McKinsey for the Young Professionals program of the World Bank Group. Now, the World Bank is obviously and reasonably a highly coveted employer, right?
That's what I would expect, yeah.
But so is McKinsey.
True.
And he also clearly had a very bright future at McKinsey and could have chosen to stay within that comfort zone, but he did not. Within 6 months at the World Bank, he realized that the World Bank wasn't for him. And he explains the reason why the World Bank is not for him rather bluntly. And I will quote him here: because of the bureaucracy, which meant filling out a form even to go to and see the dentist. However, his critique of the World Bank group goes even further than that, but I will leave it to you to read that passage for yourself.
Was it about the internal processes, so the bureaucracy, as you explained, or was it more about the mission and what the bank does?
I think it was both, because at some point he also made a point about IMF,
Okay.
and also in some of his interventions he mentioned his time at the World Bank. Anyway, I think that is of course his personal experience and his own assessment, because I actually know someone from our generation who left McKinsey for the World Bank's Young Professional program and is still happily in the program 2 years later. So I think experiences clearly vary.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I mean, adding on your previous point, it also depends on the person's personal motivations and beliefs, right?
Yeah.
It means if you believe so much in the World Bank's mission, you might be able to tolerate the bureaucracy and the annoying processes for that.
Yeah, and he worked in, I think, in the development sector later. I will come back to this. But still, I think this was his first major risky, or if you prefer, bold career decision. And the second one followed very quickly. He was offered a position back in Cote d'Ivoire, the development work that I was just talking about.
Yeah.
And even before that, he had already made another unexpected move, which is to relocate from the New York office back to the New York office of McKinsey. Because I said he went to the World Bank, didn't like it, asked McKinsey if they are willing to take him back. I said
In
yes.
New York.
Yeah, in New York. And then from New York, he moved back to the Paris office. Now, you might wonder why I'm saying this is also a kind of risky move. It's because I think salaries are generally higher in the US than in Europe. But yeah, I won't tell you what was his reason here. It was, in fact, a very simple and very personal reason. And then comes what he himself calls a homecoming, his return to Cote d'Ivoire. And yeah, I would call it something else. I would call it his second bold career move. And honestly, I personally think it is his boldest career move. He was offered a position within in French, Direction et Contrôle des Grands Travaux, which is a government body tasked with overseeing public spending and acting as an in-house consultancy on major infrastructure projects. So on paper, it was a strategic institution, but in reality, it was struggling badly, actually. At the time, it wasn't even paying salaries, including his own, when he joined.
That's for sure a bold move. I think in general, going back from Europe or from the US back to Africa is a bold move, which requires a lot of courage because obviously you're giving up a lot of comfort, certainty, and so on. And in this case, going to a position where you don't even have a salary is
Wait,
another dimension of bold.
until I tell you. Like, what makes this decision truly astonishing is that this happened at the exact moment when Goldman Sachs was offering him a high paying position in London. And yet, Tidjane Thiam chose Côte d'Ivoire.
Wow. Yes. Yeah. Actually, this is interesting because it reminds me of a video that I watched recently about Jamie Dimon, the star CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And obviously, I'm digressing here, but I see a clear parallel between their paths. So early in his career, he too turned down offers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to join his mentor as his assistant. And his mentor at the time was the president of American Express.
Mhm.
And his motivation was that he thought he will have much more impact from that position compared to, let's say, an investment banker position, even at much higher salary and at a more prestigious institution. And it seems that a similar vision or a similar motivation is the one that drove Tidjane Thiam in his decision as well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. And he also explains quite candidly why he wanted so badly to leave McKinsey at that point. I won't spoil that part of the story either. But taken together, this decision tells you a great deal about how he understood risk, purpose, and responsibility at that moment in his life.
Why did he want to leave McKinsey again?
No, I said I won't spoil that part of the story, so yeah.
Okay, if you insist. I'm going to read the book anyway, so.
Yeah. But yeah, he went into quite some details about how he dealt with the challenge of managing an almost bankrupt institution in Cote d'Ivoire. And again, I won't tell the operational specifics here. Instead, I would like to offer my own reading of his approach to this phase of his career. I would say his approach to leading the directorate in Cote d'Ivoire was unmistakably market oriented. I already said he's pro market, right? And it was almost as if he was running a private sector entity. He focused on cutting costs, improving efficiency, and streamlining processes. And he even notes that his management consulting skills came in handy at this stage. And by his own account, I think it worked. However, there is one detail in this chapter that really stood out to me and deserves reflection. One of the very first things he did after taking over the directorate, in his own words, was to beg Western donors for help.
So
And
the topic of development aid is
exactly,
coming back.
exactly. So I said he's pro market, all right? And you will see how nicely this ties back to one of the previous books we have discussed by Axel Kabou about Africa refusing to develop. And if you haven't listened to that episode, we invite you to check it out. Now, that's important because Tidjane Thiam is, as we have established, very much pro-market. And yet, here he actively turned to development aid. But I will call this the goods kind of development aid. And the nuance lies precisely here. I say goods, not naively, but because in this case, the funds did not disappear, right? The funds did not end up in private pockets and they were not wasted. They were used strategically. And again, I will spare you the operational details of how he did it, but according to his own account, he succeeded in turning the directorate into a functioning, credible, and impactful institution to the point where it began selling its expertise to other African countries. So, in other words, he turned a failing public body into something very much close to a revenue generating machine.
Which is indeed, in this context, very impressive, I believe. I mean, remember, this institution was unable to pay his own salary when he started. However, I would like to add, I personally think that being pro-market is not contradicting with using development aid. Although I know there are some thinkers like Tampi Samoyo, whose book we will for sure review in the future. She thinks that development aid does not go hand in hand with commercial markets. However, let's say if I am a CFO and I want to raise funds and I have the option between development aid, which is cheap money, and raising funds on the market, which is expensive money, or getting a budget from the government. I don't have the option of getting the budget from the government. I think a reasonable solution is to go for development aid. But as you said, as long as that aid is invested in the right place, and as long as there is no leakages and there is no corruption.
Yeah, I see that you are going to be very strict in your critique to Dambi Samoyo's book.
We'll get back to that in a future episode for sure.
Anyway, for me, this is the most interesting section of the book. It is the major career move, the one that combines risk, learning, political exposure, and impact. It's also full of events, including a successful coup, one that would ultimately upend his Côte d'Ivoire adventure.
It seems that coup still keep happening throughout his life, right?
Yeah, and it kind of impacted his personality, I think he wrote in the book.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, these kind of events, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are many remarkable stories that you would really want to read for yourself in this specific section. But at least I would like to leave you with one sentence that, to me, captures everything about this phase of his professional life. Quote unquote, leading the directorate proved to be the most enjoyable job I ever had. So the second big chunk of his career, second because I'm essentially dividing his professional life into three phases. The first one around management consulting and development work in Cote d'Ivoire, and also at the World Bank, and the second in finance, and now the third in politics and perhaps writing. I don't know. Now, the second phase in finance, right? Again, anyone who knows Tidjane Thiam already knows this part of the story. His positions, his titles, his trajectory. So I won't go back over them here. Instead, I would like to focus on what I see as the most striking or recurring theme across all of his roles in this sector. Have you guessed it?
Racism?
Racism.
I guess, yeah.
But first, let's listen to what Mylène had to say about this recurring theme.
In many instances throughout the book, Tidjane Thiam appears reluctant to explicitly invoke racism. And he says so, that he doesn't like to invoke racism in many cases. However, he repeatedly attributes several of the difficulties he encountered to racism. Thiam attributes both his difficulty in securing an internship while in school until his father was compelled to, I quote, make some calls, and his challenging professional start after graduation to racism. While this interpretation is possible, these experiences may also be explained by a more general tendency towards social and national preference, the inclination to prioritize, I quote, one's own. In such a context, it is reasonable to ask why a French or European company would favor an Ivorian candidate over French or European citizens with comparable qualifications. This practice is not unique to France and is observable in many countries across the world, developed or developing. Labeling such decisions as racism would only be warranted if the primary motivation factor or the primary motivating factor were the individual's race rather than nationality, networks, or institutional familiarity. Without clear evidence that exclusion was based on blackness itself, these experiences may reflect structural favoritism or in group bias rather than racism in the strictest sense of the word.
I don't know if I agree with Milen, actually. For me, the definition of racism, or again, without being super theoretical and philosophical here, is the discrimination on the basis of the color of the skin, or the name, or the fact that the person is not white. So the discrimination with the power dynamic, basically, is not just discrimination, but with a power dynamic in that society, especially if the discriminating party is a majority.
Yeah, I get your point. I think Milen's point is mostly about finding an evidence to confidently say this was due to racism. But there is one anecdote that he recounts, which can perhaps serve as an evidence, right? Because according to Cham, finding a position after his Cote d'Ivoire experience was particularly difficult, and he's very clear about why. Kind of, I think he's attributes it to racism. The story is that he asked for help from one of his former INSEAD classmates, right? And the INSEAD classmate had since reached a senior position in a recruitment firm. So his friend agreed to help and shared his CV, changing his name to a white sounding one. Basically, a name that would make recruiters assume that he was white. So
like Eric Dubois,
for instance. I don't know if there is any Eric Dubois listening to us, but yeah, there is. We have nothing against you. Anyway, so the response with the white sounding name was enthusiastic. And until the moment the friend, Tidjane Thiam's friend, clarified that Tidjane Thiam was black and African. So at that point, recruiters simply replied that they could not hire him.
Yeah, and I think that's evidence, right? It's very clear that they were impressed by his profile, or rather convinced by his profile based on his credentials. But the fact that he's African deterred them from making the final decision.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think what this story reveals is not just individual prejudice, but a system of exclusion that operates quietly or efficiently and without any embarrassment, kind of. And while this experience took place, I think, decades ago, it would be naive to think that it no longer exists today. In many cases, it's still expressed in blunt terms and it persists, not only for black candidates, but also, I would argue, for people with Arab names.
And I would say these kind of experiments are still conducted these days, and the results are always the same.
Yeah.
For job offers or even for getting an apartment.
Yeah. I get the point that Milen made about national preference, but I think this has got to the point where parents now consciously choose neutral or ambiguous names for their children simply to spare them from having to confront these kind of barriers later in life.
Another proof that discrimination exists based on names. Yeah.
Anyway, I think what I appreciate is that Thiam does not shy away from naming these realities, neither in his book nor in public interventions. And in his case, I think he explains that he encountered this most acutely in France and less so in the UK and in the United States. But from my experience, France is far from the only place where this phenomenon exists. I personally know people of color who uh, have lowered their expectations in terms of seniority, responsibility, and salary, and still failed to get hired, despite outstanding academic and professional credentials in other European countries. So I believe Thiam himself mentioned France, Germany, and Italy as countries that display this pattern simply by looking at the CEOs of companies from those countries. So these are proxy indicators that kind of tell you what's happening. Although I think there is also a point to be made that people prefer to hire candidates from their own nationalities, which one could understand. But there is also the fact that sometimes it's just blatant racism. And what this tells us is that discrimination does not disappear even at the top. If anything, it can become more pronounced and sometimes even harsher.
Yeah. And I would believe it's even the latter than the first.
Mhm.
And telling from my personal experience working in Europe, you still see people of color at the quote unquote bottom of the ranks, let's say, which more reflects, in my view, an economic reality as European economies do need to import talent from abroad to keep the economy growing and afloat, of course, given the aging society, etc. But you rarely see people of color climb the ranks to the top. So the glass ceiling is very real. And I think the indicator that he gives a number of CEOs of color in these countries is a very concrete measure of that.
Yeah. And Tiam recounts many stories that illustrate this, but there is one particular that shows how fed up he was with the recruiting world back then. And that was right before he took his first position in finance. I would not spoil it here, though I believe he has shared version of this in interviews that I've listened to. But it's a powerful episode and really I encourage you to read it in the book.
Come on, stop not telling us stories.
Uh, well, it's okay. It's after Cote d'Ivoire, right? He returned to McKinsey, and yeah, McKinsey took him back for what was it, a second or third time?
I lost count now.
Well,
After Cote d'Ivoire, it's the third time?
no,
Yeah, because first he joined McKinsey after school, and then he went to the World Bank, and then joined McKinsey again in New York.
yeah, and then
And
Cote
then went to
d'Ivoire.
Cote d'Ivoire, and then
Exactly.
okay, so third
and
time.
back to exactly. So, but I believe this period was more of a transition than a real kind of return. He kept looking for more senior roles, and many of the same barriers kind of apply. Um, Same rejections because he was black. And then one day, he received a call from a recruiter looking for his senior executive. And his response to the recruiter was disarmingly direct. He told the recruiter, "Go back to the CEO and tell him that I'm a 6'4" black man and that I will only meet him if he's genuinely prepared to consider me." Long story short, the meeting happened, and when he first met the CEO, the man opened the conversation by saying, "So you're the guy who thinks I'm racist?" And Tiam didn't walk away, but he competed, and after a rigorous process, he got the job. So that role was actually his entry in finance at Aviva.
Okay, that's a nice one. And maybe a good tip here for any bright people of color out there who are looking for jobs in Europe or in the West, more general, start with that sentence when you get an email from your recruiter or your hiring manager and tell them, that you are a person of color.
Do you think that's a strategy?
Especially if you're bright, right? Because I think that
Kind of
way,
lower your expectation.
I mean, yeah, or rather, in a sense, you're telling them,
Being confrontational.
yeah, exactly. I'm confronting your potential racism. And nobody will dare tell you, okay, now I'm not sure anymore, or yeah, like.
But still, as I said, he had to go through a competitive process. What if at the end of the process, the result was negative and he wasn't hired? Would you still argue
True.
that it
Yeah, I think
worked?
that's true. Again, back to Milen's point, you never can prove racism, actually.
Well, you can
It's,
sometimes.
yeah, I mean, unless you do the experiment with the CV as he did earlier and then change the name or whatever. So, yeah, but anyways, people can always find excuses and say the vacancy doesn't exist anymore or whatever. Another reflection to what you mentioned earlier regarding his point of view on being pro-market, but also on the other side criticizing people who are liberal or pretend to be liberal while not um, giving much importance to inclusivity,
Pluralism.
exactly, inclusivity, pluralism, etc. And I would like to link this to the point that Milan mentioned, that, yeah, people will choose people from their nationality because they trust them more. But if you dig into that, I think that's not right if you pretend to be a pro-market person, because the market economy assumes meritocracy. And that means that you have to choose people based on competence,
Yeah.
not on other kinds of preference, be it people from your nationality or people from your town or people from your family, because that is the exact opposite of meritocracy. And meritocracy goes hand in hand with fair competition and the market
Yeah,
economy.
I think that's a fair point, a valid argument. There is a second recurring theme I would like to come back to in a moment. But before that, let me return briefly to his other bold career move, because they certainly don't stop once he enters finance. His transition into the financial sector begins in London, right? In the insurance sector, to be more precise, where he takes on a group strategy and development director role at Aviva. You can see it on his LinkedIn. And at that point, you might think that his appetite for risk would finally settle, but it doesn't. He eventually leaves Aviva to join Prudential, essentially because he felt he was being unfairly overlooked for the CEO position at Aviva. And because his chances of reaching the top were clearer at Prudential. So this is getting complex, right? It's the same country. There is one company where, the chances were not that clear. You could argue it was
Racism
racism,
again. Yeah.
but it's in the same country where you have a different company where
Yeah.
he had better chances of becoming a CEO. And yeah, he does in fact become CEO of Prudential and delivers stellar results. I think for 5 years or so. And then comes yet another leap, because while successfully leading Prudential, he agrees after long negotiations and considerable hesitation to leave the role and take on the position of CEO at Credit Suisse.
The late Credit Suisse.
Once again, the pattern holds here, right? A willingness to walk away from success, to accept uncertainty, and to take on risk even when he's already at the very top. And Thiam provides detailed accounts of his work across all of these rules, I think material that would be interesting or even fascinating for anyone in finance, someone doing an MBA or executive MBA, I don't know, or aspiring to leadership positions at that level. But as I have said, I want to recount those details here because they are technical and about finance, how he dealt with some of the issues, his views about the 2008 crisis, kind of predicted it.
Everybody says they predicted the 2008 crisis. At
Well,
hindsight,
maybe he did actually. because
yeah,
he sold
I'm
his-
not I'm not arguing against that.
Anyway, instead, let me stay focused on the recurring themes that run through this phase of his career. And here again, racism surfaces repeatedly, particularly in his accounts of his time at Credit Suisse. He describes a rocky start, and reading between the lines, I got the sense that he never quite felt at ease there and may even have come to regret taking on the role. He was also very candid in denouncing what he presents as deeply unethical practices within the bank. One in particular caught my attention. It was the use of Credit Suisse accounts by a former high ranking official of the Third Reich who was hiding in Argentina. And that episode alone tells you a great deal about how he ultimately came to view the institution, kind of.
Yeah, it probably makes sense why he never felt at ease at the bank, right? In the last 2 decades, Credit Suisse went through a series of scandals and litigations linked to a lot of issues. For example, high risk clients, as you mentioned, tax evasion, money laundering, even. And that all eroded the reputation of the institution. So it was a very difficult institution to manage and to lead. And as you know, all of this led to the collapse of the bank following a bank run in 2023 and the emergency acquisition by UBS.
Yeah. Now, the other recurring theme I wanted to touch on briefly is family, or to be more precise, work life balance. But before getting into that, Milan discusses some points he made about education. Let's listen to him.
As a product of the elite tiers of the French educational system, Tidjane Thiam offers a pointed critique of what he characterizes as its near-religious fixation on achievement. He argues that the system places disproportionate emphasis on outcomes, educational achievement, grades, rankings, and competitive selection, while giving insufficient weight to effort as a meaningful measure of merit. While this critique is compelling on a human level, it raises important questions at a systemic one. Achievement-based evaluation, particularly in highly selective systems, is often defended on the grounds of objectivity and comparability. Outcomes are easier to standardize and assess across large populations than effort, which is inherently subjective and unevenly observable. Introducing effort as a formal evaluative variable risk, privileging perception over performance, and may inadvertently reproduce bias, as judgments of effort are often shaped by cultural expectations, teacher discretion, and social proximity. Moreover, emphasizing effort without adequately accounting for structural inequality can be misleading. Students do not exert effort on a level playing field. Access to preparatory resources, parental support, stable learning environments, and cultural capital varies widely. In this sense, effort itself is partly conditioned by privilege. Ironically, individuals who have successfully navigated elite institutions such as Thiam himself may be among the best positioned to sustain high levels of effort precisely because they benefited from early structural advantages of a stable family and studies within systems that provided some level of security. That said, Thiam's critique usefully exposes a blind spot in meritocratic systems that conflict achievement with ability. A more productive approach may lie not in replacing achievement with effort, but in contextualizing achievement, recognizing trajectories, constraints, and starting points. Without such nuance, appeals to effort risk becoming either morally appealing but operationally weak, or worse, another metric through which inequality is quietly reproduced.
Now, what do you think of that?
I think what Milene is saying ties up very well to what we said, to the quote that you mentioned initially from Thiam around the inequalities that are created between children and how these inequalities created at childhood basically propagate and influence these children's future lives. And I like his critique of meritocracy. Actually, it reminded me of another book I read before, and I don't want to digress too much, but it's a really good book, not written by an African. It's by Michael Sandel, American philosopher, and it's called The Tyranny of Merit. So he basically discusses this matter at length.
Interesting. I personally think that Thiam's proposition of measuring efforts also makes sense somehow because no matter where you're from, what's your family background, your class in society, you can always struggle or show what you're trying to do to achieve a certain result. So the difficulty lies in how do we objectively measure people's efforts without reproducing inequalities that a school system based on achievements kind of produce.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about work-life balance. In the first chapters, he speaks often and movingly about his mother, and in the chapters on his professional career, it becomes clear that family considerations influenced several of his major career decisions, sometimes positively, and you may already be connecting this to an earlier decision that I said I wouldn't spoil. And to give you a hint, it's about leaving McKinsey.
Was it the one when he left McKinsey to go to Côte d'Ivoire?
Yeah.
Okay, so are you going to tell us that story finally?
I'm thinking.
Okay.
No, I mean, okay, it was because he had planned a date night for his wife's 30th birthday at a restaurant with months-long waiting list. But on that day, his boss, who was a partner at McKinsey, was unhappy with slides he prepared for a client meeting that was scheduled the next day.
Yeah, these sound like the words you always hear when you hear management consultant.
Yeah.
Slide, partner, and client.
Yeah. So he told the partner about his date night with his wife, and the partner's answer was client first.
Yeah. He said, please fix.
So
those of you who know management consulting memes will understand that.
Yeah. So he canceled the dinner, but he made a promise to his wife that he would not still be at that firm for her next birthday. So for me, that moment says everything, not about ambition, but about limits.
Or boundaries, rather. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah, boundaries.
Yeah.
But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm wondering because he was supposed to, remember, that was the moment he got the job at Goldman Sachs in investment banking, right?
Yep.
So which one is more challenging?
It's
Or
probably similar.
yeah, so it's
Yeah,
would have been kind of similar to McKinsey, right? In
yeah,
terms of schedule and
yeah,
work-life balance.
yeah. But it's like a human nature. People always think it's the grass is greener outside. Maybe he thought investment banking would be a good alternative, more flexible. I don't know.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Anyway, so family considerations influence his career decisions positively, negatively, I don't know. And sometimes career decisions could have also influenced his family in ways that I think involved personal risk, such as not the return to Cote d'Ivoire that I mentioned, but a return to Cote d'Ivoire that happened at a particular volatile moment, which I don't want to spoil. But what I found especially striking, though, is what he doesn't dwell on. He mentioned his separation from his wife in just a single sentence and moves on. And that's one of his sons died of cancer. Um, I believe while he was still at Credit Suisse, but he doesn't go into personal detail about that loss. And I think that restraint deserves respect. He does, however, note that the news was leaked by Swiss tabloid, probably by his collaborators who were aware that his kid was dying. And I think that's something that clearly caused him deep pain. I've heard him speak about it before reading the book, actually. So, again, I'm not spoiling because if you are like me and listen to his interviews, you would know maybe, I don't know, 1/10 of the book before reading it.
Yeah.
So he spoke about that particular event in an interview. And I think that also coincides with his final year at the bank, adding yet another layer of strain to an already difficult chapter.
And he did not leave Credit Suisse on his own will, right?
No.
Yeah, at least not completely, as this followed a surveillance scandal,
Yep.
which was also big on the news.
Yeah.
And what happened is that the bank was found to have hired private investigators to spy on a former executive who left the firm to a competitor,
Yeah.
which kind of sounds crazy.
Well, it's not actually. According to him, it's legal, I think, in Switzerland
Okay.
in the sector.
Yeah. Okay.
Or it's not illegal. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying it's not illegal to privately spy
In
on someone
Switzerland, yeah.
in Switzerland.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, not on someone, not just on anyone, but
On a former executive.
yeah, on an official who leave a company for the competitor.
Interesting. Anyways, although Thiam denied the fact that he ordered the spying, the board's confidence and relationship was strained because of this incident, and also, I believe, because of the dimension it took in the media. And the board said it happened under your leadership. That's why you're responsible for that. And that's why he ended up resigning due to the pressure. In any case, I would say that the environment of Credit Suisse as a working place seems to be extremely toxic and difficult for anyone to flourish in there.
Yeah, and there is more that he shared on how he and why he left, I think, in the book, but I will leave it to you to read it for yourself. However, to conclude this section, Milen shared some general reflections on his professional career, which I'll invite you to listen to now.
Professionally, there is hardly any doubt that Tidjane worked his way up the professional ladder and remains one of the most brilliant African minds in the corporate world. Having run Prudential and Credit Suisse, what more can an individual want other than doing something he considers more meaningful? In his case, engagement in politics to be of service to his country and his countrymen. While the elections in Cote d'Ivoire turned out to be nothing short of what many connoisseurs of African political systems expected, There remains hope and a bright light at the end of the tunnel. Godspeed, Tidjane.
With that, I would like to move to the third and final theme of this episode, what I called his rocky start in politics. So after leaving Credit Suisse in 2020, Tidjane Thiam still had many career decisions ahead of him. He's, after all, very much of working age back then, I think. And yes, if you guessed that he turned down major opportunities to become CEO or chairman of large corporations, you would be right.
It would be a good retirement job, I guess.
Yeah. Now, instead, he chose something far more ambitious, and in my opinion, far riskier. You have mentioned it. He jumped into politics. And in between, he did play a role in Africa's response to COVID-19. But the bigger move, I think, came when he took leadership of one of the largest political parties in Cote d'Ivoire, the very party that was founded by his late grandfather, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. And today, he openly plans to run for the presidency of Cote d'Ivoire. So you can tell why I gave this section its title of Rocky Start in Politics, right?
Yeah, obviously, we talked about that in the beginning. His candidacy to the presidency was rejected by the court based on the fact that he acquired French citizenship in 1987, which meant that he had forfeited his Ivorian citizenship by then, according to Ivorian law. Or at least this is what I found when I did research. And Thiam actually did renounce his French citizenship in early 2025 in a bid to meet the eligibility criteria, but the court held that it was too late now to reverse that process, and he is no longer an Ivorian citizen, according to them. In his interviews, Thiam is very vocal about this rejection, considering it as unjust and politically motivated.
Just to add some more context, his argument is that he was born French, okay? Remember, he inherited the French citizenship.
From his father, right?
Yes, from his father. So he argues that he was born French and he was also born Ivorian. So he cannot
Thanks to his
technically
mother.
lose the Ivorian citizenship by taking the French because he did not
He was born with both, basically.
exactly take the French citizenship. And the other argument is that, he was the first person to whom this specific article of the Constitution was applied to. So, however, all of this that we are talking about, he did not mention them in the book. He did not really mention his political hurdles in the book. Instead, the final chapter of the book is titled Africa's Century. And that title alone tells you how deeply he believes in the continent's future.
To end on a note of hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is a chapter where he steps back and reflects on Africa's development challenges. He revisits, for instance, the differences between former French and British colonies, and draws a parallel with the political instability that has characterized many Francophone African states. So I initially thought that this would be the part where I might be able to critique his analysis, but remember, Thiam is very smart, so he doesn't offer easy answers. He's careful, nuanced, and explicitly states, for instance, that the causes of the observed differences are complex and multifaceted. Still, he argues that current outcomes can be partly traced back to the differing colonial approaches. He contrasts the French model with the British one, which relied more on co-opting local elites, even if final decisions were made in London. And in that, he suggests, created a form of relative autonomy in British colonies. He also points to a more business and market-oriented logic. something that I personally agree is still lacking in many African francophone countries that I know.
I completely agree with this point. And although this will need a whole discussion on its own, I believe many former French colonies inherited the complex and strenuous bureaucracy and some version of the French statism, basically the intervention of the state into the economy, which completely hinders the free market.
Yeah, absolutely. And he goes on to offer thoughtful reflections on franc CFA, the currency that is used by many francophone West African countries, and also reflections on the difficulty of governing fragmented and highly diverse states, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But he doesn't necessarily promote the United States of Africa. At least he did not. I don't think he mentioned that in the book. But he discusses borders and institutions that are often ill adapted to African realities and that continue to generate the tensions we see today. And reading this chapter, I was left wanting more, not because it was weak, but because it was clear that he approaches development issues in a genuinely holistic way, and that there is more that one can learn from his ideas on this particular topic. I think he understands, for example, the link between malnutrition among pregnant women and long term economic productivity, which is, I think, a connection that many African leaders, I'm sure, will fail to grasp. And I even know engineers who struggle to see the economic opportunity in investing in sectors that are dismissed as social. So I think he could write a whole book on these issues and offer his analytical perspective.
Yeah, and I think his work in the directorate in Cote d'Ivoire as well is a good case study of being able to turn around a government entity and to make it productive.
Yeah, he always refers to it.
Yeah.
He also draws parallels with the development paths of Gulf countries, particularly through sovereign investment funds. He refers, for instance, to the role of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and how it grew over the years and contrasts it with the missed opportunities of resource rich African countries.
Good that you mentioned the point on resource rich, because usually economists argue that sovereign wealth funds make sense for governments which generate a lot of cash from resources, basically, be it oil and gas or diamonds, etc. So it doesn't make sense for every country. I remember this discussion came up when Trump was suggesting that the US has its own sovereign wealth fund. But anyways, that's why you find these kind of structures.
But
like in Norway,
resource in
the Gulf
the
regions.
African case is kind of different because remember he's from Cote d'Ivoire and the resource there is cocoa because they are the largest producer of cocoa in the world. So they are generating a lot, and also I think cashew. They're perhaps the largest in the world or the second. So yeah, it's agricultural resources in their case. Well, they used to have ivory, but now it's no longer.
Yeah, but again, I mean, maybe that warrants more detailed study whether it makes sense for a country like Cote d'Ivoire to create a sovereign wealth fund. But not our topic for today.
He notes similar ideas to the sovereign wealth funds in Gulf countries that he once suggested to his grandfather, such as investing strategically in the cocoa manufacturing sector in where, as I just said, Cote d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer. So, for instance, I think his idea was by taking equity stakes in companies like Nestle rather than relying on embargoes in an attempt to push prices upwards. But unfortunately, those ideas were never implemented, and I think had they been implemented, they might well have transformed the country's economic trajectory.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a different mechanism, right? It's not about establishing a sovereign wealth fund, but it's about the government taking stakes in the companies, which will contribute to aligning incentives and also creating more leverage for the government.
Leverage is it's a
Exactly,
very
and a
good,
source of income as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because he said the tools that the governments use currently is trying to control the price, and they are kind of not effective
Yeah.
because they have tried. His grandfather had tried. I think they even did something with Ghana recently.
Yeah.
Try to increase the prices, but it doesn't always work. And because it's a perishable product, you may end up having
harming the farmers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what happened back then.
Yeah.
So it's smarter, according to him, to instead have a seat in the boardroom of the
Yeah.
big companies.
Makes sense.
So leverage is the keyword here.
Yeah.
But there are many more details about finance, as I said, and also about his idea on Africa's development that I will not unpack here, and that I will invite you to read for yourself. So I will stop here.
And so we close our journey through Without Prejudice by Tidjane Thiam, a timely memoir, but also a reminder that excellence does not erase barriers. It only exposes them more clearly. And that sometimes the most radical act is not rising to the top, but choosing what to race for. Also keep in mind, if Africa's century is to be written, it won't be written by comfort alone. It will be written by people willing to choose uncertainty and still believe the continent is worth the risk. If this story sparks something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition. You've been listening to Threads of Ifriqiya with Ramdan and Hajar. A bientôt, and stay curious.